Hey, this is Jelle, growing bonsai, and today we're looking at how do you develop a bonsai when you start all the way from seed cutting or air layer into a more refined specimen. In other words, how do you go from a little twig like this to a tree like that? There are 4 distinct phases of developing a bonsai tree. If you don't know the different phases, you might be doing work on your tree that is not suitable for the phase of development. Let's delve into this. Many of the magnificent bonsai that you see are not grown from seed or cutting or even air layer by the owner. So this tree, for instance, I got as a fairly well developed trunk. So I got it after phase 2. Basically the very first stage of growing bonsai from nothing is the propagation phase. And the propagation phase typically takes 2, maybe 3 years. The propagation phase means that you take seeds or cuttings or air layers and create a new tree out of that material. These are all cuttings of one particular Japanese maple variety that I really like. And they keep on growing for another year or 2 before I plant them out in a big container. This cutting is 2 years old. This is of a Nishikigawa. This is a cork bark maple variety. And I am keeping it in this pot so it grows really slowly. And that is one of the key things that I want to share about developing young material in the propagation phase. Next to this, I have this oak. This oak has been growing in this pot now for 3 years. And you see already I have shaped the trunk. I've got a very long sacrifice whip on there and I've got a short tree here. This tree, propagated last year. This is an Deshoyo, a red leaf Japanese maple. I air layered this last year of one of my bigger trees. Now what is the difference between seed, cutting and air layer? Quite simply said, with seed you get genetic variation. So by using seeds there is a chance that you find a nice new version of a tree. For most local trees that's not going to be the case because they're quite stable, but if you look at Japanese maple does do recombined genes. And there's a few thousand varieties of Japanese maple, and if they grow mixed together, then you get a new variety. And that's actually what happens with this one. And these are all cutting grown. And they're cutting grown, why? Well, because they're identical as the mother plant. So these have a very, very deeply cut leaf, yet they produce a corky bark. So this is a new variety and I'm growing it as a cutting. Now, not every species grows as a cutting, but many species do. You just need to check how do you propagate them. Air layering, the same benefit as growing from a cutting, but it can result in much bigger trees. This is actually a very thin air layer. You can also take air layers of branches this thick. So you get a very big branch straight away. And that might actually skip the second phase of developing a bonsai from nothing. But we'll get there in a second, because that is the growing out phase. We're not yet in the growing out phase, because I was going to explain to you why I keep these in a small pot. What happens in a small pot is that the nodes get very, very close to each other because there's not a lot of space for the tree to grow, so they grow quite slowly. Now this whip is starting to push and the internodes are too long already for me. I am looking for really these 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch, 1 centimeter wide nodes, internodes. That way, if I ever want to cut back, I have lots and lots of places where buds can pop, because most trees don't create buds on the internode, they only create it at the nodes. So if I then cut off just below this node, then it will die back all the way to there, and the longer this internode is, the further it dies back. So I want on the first, what shall we say, 1/2 foot, 15 centimeters or so, I want short internodes so that whenever I want to cut back, I can, and there's a natural back budding for these deciduous trees. Keep in mind for pines and junipers, this works very, very differently, so it doesn't apply there. Now you also know why I keep my young plants for the first maybe 3 years in a small pot before I go into the bulking up, the growing out phase. This for me is still the initial propagation phase. Another part that is important during this phase is if you do not want to cut back all that much, but you want movement, that you put movement in the trunk already at a very early stage. Because a tight bend, like I have here at the base, you're not going to get in by itself once the tree is this thick. Only these very thin twigs allow you to make very short, tight bends. So do that early on in the propagation phase. That is also the stage where you need to look at the roots. Now we all know the nabari of a tree is important, so you want a nice spreading root. Typically, if you grow from seed, a singular root will come, the taproot, that is seeking for water. But in a pot they don't need it. So I typically, in the first year of development, I already cut off the taproot. At that time you get lots and lots of new side roots, and that will cause you to get a good nabari. So even these youngsters are repotted frequently. Actually, I try to repot them every single year, work the roots, develop this nice spreading root base early on. If that is all set up properly, then if you grow them out, you bulk them up, the nabari will stay pretty decent, especially if you then every 2 or 3 years lift them and cut them back. So that brings me to the second phase of growing out a bonsai, bulking up. Your rooted cutting is 2-3 years old. It's about this tall. You've shaped it, you've worked on the roots, and now it is time to beef them up. Now the easiest way to do this is, of course, take them out of the pot, plant them in the ground, and allow them to grow. You know, I've got a growing field and I do that for a number of trunks. That is the fastest way to get fattening up of the trunk. The problem is you also get very big cuts, you get very big branches, and everything gets quite coarse. So only do that if you're aiming at these very, very massive trunks. If you want something more elegant, you can also do it in a pot. This one has only been pot grown. I produced this by air layering off a commercial, what is it? Well, something like this, a little whip. A branch like this grafted on a regular green maple. This is Nishikigawa. This is the mother plant of all the Nishikigawa that I have. And this is started to bark over right now. And I'm growing it in a pot, fairly large pot. You can see it is actually quite tall with heavy, strong branches. And why do I do it? Well, because I can now better control the lower branches. I can control the movement in the trunk. I can check the nabari quite easily. All of this is quite difficult when it is in the full ground, because once they start growing in the full ground, they start exploding. Also, the internode length, even on these long branches, is quite manageable. So that means that if I ever see a nice branch like this, I can decide I'm going to air layer this section off and use it. But for me, it's mostly about control. So now I'm noticing that this is getting towards a nice thickness. Maybe one more year, and then I can take this off and use this branch as my starting point of my bonsai. Now this growing out phase can easily take 5 or maybe 10 years. What you do in this process is you allow this trunk to just grow. The base swells up. Every 2 or 3 years you lift it and you prune back the roots. And at that time you also consider, do I still want to get this to fatten up, or do I want to cut back? By cutting back, you aid in taper and in directional change. Here there has been a small cut made once, here there has been a small cut made once, and this is the next phase of my tree. In 1 or 2 years I'm going to cut this off here, and this is going to be developed as my next tree. So you see already 80-90% of this tree is going to be thrown away. And that's where air layering of course comes in. You can then put an air layer on place, say I take this top out and I plant this in a pot or in the ground and start beefing that up. So straight away you skip the propagation of young plants and you go into the semi-beefed up tree. So this is phase 2. Takes about 5, maybe 10 years. For some species a lot more. If you want a very, very, very big ones, it could be easily 20 or 30 years. But count on a lot of time to develop this. Now once you are happy with the tree like this, then you lift it from the ground, you cut off the branches, and you enter phase 3, the design. Right, so you've propagated your tree, you've let it grow out, you've lifted it, you've planted it in a container. Then what happens? And this is a nice example of what happens, because this tree I got a few years ago, and at the time I removed all the branches. I just left little stumps on here, and that is typically what happens. All the branches that are grown in the field or in a large pot, as you're growing out the tree to its size, they are typically removed because they are thick, they're very coarse, and you can't really use them for bonsai. Now this Stelkova is an example of a tree that has just been pulled out of the field. I pulled this out a few weeks ago from one of my growing beds, and it has rooted nicely in the pot. I at the time pruned back this branch and that branch. Here I made a cut to a side branch, here I made a cut to a side branch, so this can now start to close over. And what you may notice is here and here there have been earlier prunings done to the tree. And if you really look carefully, you see here the flare of the roots. I've worked these roots twice over the course of this life. This was grown from a cutting similar like this from another tree that I had, and after 2 years in a little pot with the roots spread out nicely, I planted it out in full ground and left it there to grow for a few years. I think it's been in the ground for 3 years or so. It's not much, but that's also why I now have a very modest trunk to work with and not a very massive trunk. And over the last couple of weeks it's become clear here that the bark seems to have died between these two wounds. So let's see next year how I'm going to deal with this. Worst case scenario, I'm going to go all the way back to here, and I have a very strong tapered trunk into this tree, and that makes a nice little elegant bonsai as well. So a trunk doesn't have to be all that fat, but to get this thickness in a pot, this will take me maybe twice as long as in the field. Growing to this size take you 10 times as much time. Anyway, this is from the fattening up, going into the design phase. Many deciduous trees will start resprouting, they'll create new branches, and those you can develop out into a more refined canopy. And that is actually what I'm doing here. Now the design phase knows many different phases. Basically, this is a Japanese maple that I got from a field grower. It was grown as a regular tree, and I cut off everything. On this side I removed a big root. It was originally sitting at this angle in the ground. This was a side branch. This was the main branch of the main trunk. And I cut off the main trunk, and you see now this is starting to heal. Here's another big cut because I cut that main branch short at some point. Basically, the design phase involves also closing down big cuts, making big cuts and closing those over. This is a critical stage in the development of a bonsai, because now you start to decide which branches am I going to keep, what is the front of the tree, where do I need a new branch, maybe I want to graft a branch in place, and then you start positioning with wire the main branches so that it can take shape. This is the stage in which a bonsai often looks very ugly, because I'm also allowing the branches to grow very, very long. That aids in building the fatness of the branches. By cutting them back, I get taper. I work with a new side branch, so I get movement, and everything just looks unkempt during the growing season. Only over winter, like this stage of the year, I take everything off that I don't need, I wire out what I want to keep, and then it sits for another year to grow out. Allowing these branches to grow out also aids in closing these big cuts that are being made. That means that every year you allow the branches to extend less and less and less and less. And at a certain point you come to the point you say, I don't want more than this growth, and then I'll start pruning back. This is basically the stage that a lot of people buy their trees in. Unfortunately, often what we see is when you buy a tree, the roots have not been worked on previously, so you just have one or two fat ugly roots, and it's quite difficult to correct. So it is always useful to look at what can I get directly from the field, how good are the roots, how much work do I need to do on my trunk line, do I need to make major cuts like these. This stage can easily take another 5 to 10 years, and once you get this all set up with all these branches, this is now 4 or 5 years of work from cutting everything off, then you enter into the refinement stage. You also see this is still in a big plastic tub. I want the tree to have as much power as possible so it can extend long branches, it can develop this fatness, it can set these branches in place, and only once I have finished with this stage do I start looking at a nice bonsai pot. Because that's when you want to slow down growth as much as possible. That's when you say, well, the basic structure is set, and now I just want to develop the fine twigging, the nice dense crown. Here we are looking at a more refined tree. Although, as you can see here, there's a very long branch that I've allowed to grow because a new sprout happened right where I wanted it. So I am filling up this gap. But all in all, this tree is actually going from the design phase into the refinement phase. And during this phase, the tree doesn't change drastically anymore. At that time, you try to keep the tree as much as possible in the design that you have. This refinement phase can take anywhere from a few years to a few decades, depending on the species. An elm goes very quickly. In 2 or 3 years you get a fairly nice twigging on there and it looks like a mature tree, ready for instance to put into an exhibition. Because that's the ultimate pinnacle stage of a tree, is refined enough to show in a show. That is when you want no more big cuts to be visible, you want all the work that has been done on it invisible to the naked eye. Of course, somebody who grows bonsai looks at the tree and is like, oh, I know you cut there, I know you cut there. But it's not obvious from the tree anymore. No big cuts, no more wire, the tree just stands there on its own. And that is when you have a refined bonsai. This one is getting very, very close. It's not done yet, but I think in another year, maybe 2, I'm happy with this tree. So a nicely, densely, twiggy, well-developed crown, like you see here on this potentilla. This potentilla, main branches were there when I found it, but I've cut some of them back. And I regrew all of these branches over the last, I think, about 10 years. And now it is really getting to the stage that I'm really happy with it. It is nice, dense, it has the impression of age. It also looks quite mature. There is no more wire in there. Just this bunch. I allowed it to flower. Another one here in the back. I need to prune that out. But for the rest, I just need to thin it out. Prune back the growth that was developed this year. Make sure it's cleaned up, but I don't need to do all that much. However, it does take a lot of work to do, so working on this tree takes me as much time as it would take working on one of the bigger trees in early development stage, because there are just so many branches and so many little choices to be made. I do hope this explained a little bit about the 4 stages in developing bonsai. I hope you've got a few pointers on what to pay attention to in these different stages. If you want any more in-depth videos, let me know. Drop me a line down below in the comment and tell me what you are looking for. If you are interested in seeing the big elm and how I developed it, take a look there. If you've seen that already, take a look at my latest video. Keep growing bonsai. See you next time.